battle that changed World War I forever. July 1st, 1916. At 7:30 in the morning, thousands of British and French soldiers climbed out of their trenches and moved toward the German lines. They believed the enemy defenses had been heavily damaged. For 7 days, Allied artillery had been pounding the German positions. More than 1 million shells had been fired. Military commanders believed the bombardment had destroyed German defenses and weakened the soldiers waiting underground. But when the British troops crossed no man's land, they discovered something very different. The German army was still there. Machine guns opened fire. Artillery exploded across the battlefield. Men who had expected to walk forward found themselves trapped in open ground. By the end of the first day, the British Army had suffered around 57,000 casualties. Almost 20,000 men had been killed. It was the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. The battle would become known as the Battle of the Somme. It lasted more than 4 months. And although the battle did not produce a simple victory, it changed World War I forever. To understand why the Battle of the Somme happened, we need to go back to the beginning of the war. When World War I began in 1914, military leaders on both sides expected a relatively short conflict. Instead, the war became a massive struggle of trenches. On the Western Front, German forces and Allied armies became locked into defensive positions stretching across France and Belgium. The trenches protected soldiers from enemy fire. Between them was no man's land, a dangerous strip of open ground covered with shell craters, barbed wire and mud. Attacking across this territory was extremely difficult. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds in minutes. Artillery could destroy entire sections of a battlefield. Barbed wire slowed advancing soldiers and made them easy targets. The result was a terrible stalemate. The Allied commanders wanted to break through the German lines. But every major attack seemed to produce enormous casualties with little movement. By 1916, British and French commanders believed that a massive offensive could finally change the situation. The plan centered on the Somme River in northern France. The British and French armies would attack the German positions. The goal was to break through the German defenses, relieve pressure on the French army at Verdun, and force Germany to fight on multiple fronts. The preparations were enormous. Thousands of soldiers were moved toward the battlefield. Artillery pieces were positioned. Ammunition was transported by rail. Engineers prepared roads and communication lines. The Allied commanders believed the German defenses had been weakened by days of continuous artillery bombardment. But there was a major problem. The German trenches were stronger than many Allied commanders realized. German soldiers had built deep defensive positions. Some shelters were buried several meters underground. These bunkers protected troops from artillery explosions. When the bombardment began, many German soldiers simply moved underground. They waited. For 7 days, the Allied guns continued firing. The battlefield became a landscape of smoke, craters, and destroyed trees. From a distance, it appeared impossible that anything could survive. But deep underground, German soldiers waited for the attack. Then came July 1st. At 7:30 in the morning, the Allied infantry began advancing. Many British soldiers carried heavy equipment. Some units were instructed to move forward in organized lines. They believed the artillery had destroyed much of the German resistance. Instead, German machine guns emerged from their positions. The battlefield became a killing ground. Men struggled through shell holes and tangled barbed wire. Some units reached the German trenches. Others were stopped before they could get close. Communication between commanders and troops was extremely difficult. Telephone lines were often destroyed by artillery. Runners had to carry messages across dangerous ground. The result was confusion. By the end of July 1st, the scale of the losses was almost impossible to understand. The British Army had suffered tens of thousands of casualties in a single day. Some units had been almost destroyed. Entire groups of young men disappeared within hours. Many of the soldiers were volunteers who had joined the army during the early years of the war. They had trained together. They had lived together. They had marched together. Now many of them were dead or wounded. The Battle of the Somme, however, did not end after the first day. The fighting continued. The Allies launched further attacks. The Germans resisted. The battlefield became a cycle of bombardment, infantry attacks and counterattacks. The weather made conditions even worse. Rain turned the ground into thick mud. Shell craters filled with water. Soldiers struggled to move through the battlefield. Weapons became difficult to operate. Supplies were difficult to transport. And wounded men could sometimes remain trapped for hours. The battle also demonstrated how modern warfare had changed. This was no longer the type of battlefield seen in earlier European wars. Industrial technology had transformed combat. Artillery could strike positions from miles away. Machine guns could dominate open ground. Aircraft flew over the battlefield to observe enemy positions. Poison gas had already entered the war. And a new weapon appeared during the Somme offensive: the tank. On September 15, 1916, Britain used tanks in battle for the first time at Flers-Courcelette. The early tanks were slow, unreliable, and difficult to operate. Many broke down. Others became stuck in the mud. But their appearance represented something important. The armies of World War I were searching for ways to overcome the defensive power of trenches and machine guns. The tank was still primitive, but its development would eventually transform warfare. The Somme also changed the British Army itself. Before the war, Britain had possessed a relatively small professional army. During the conflict, millions of men became part of Britain's military forces. The Somme demonstrated the enormous human cost of sending large infantry formations against heavily defended positions. It also exposed weaknesses in communication, planning, and battlefield coordination. Commanders learned painful lessons. They began developing new methods for coordinating infantry, artillery, and aircraft. Artillery became more carefully integrated with infantry movements. Air reconnaissance became increasingly important. New tactical methods were developed to reduce unnecessary exposure to enemy fire. But these lessons came at an enormous price. The fighting continued through the summer and autumn. The Allies captured some territory. But the breakthrough they had hoped for never came. By the time the battle ended in November 1916, the front line had moved only a limited distance. The battlefield had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. The exact numbers remain debated by historians, but the scale was staggering. For many soldiers, the Somme became a symbol of the brutality of trench warfare. It showed how difficult it was to defeat an enemy protected by deep trenches, machine guns, and artillery. It also demonstrated that the old idea of a quick and decisive attack was becoming increasingly unrealistic. Yet the Somme did have important consequences. German forces suffered heavily. The battle placed enormous pressure on Germany's army. At the same time, the Germans were fighting the French at Verdun. The combination of Verdun and the Somme created a massive strain on German military resources. The battle also forced the Allies to rethink how they fought. The British Army became more experienced. New weapons and tactics were introduced. The use of tanks would expand. Artillery coordination improved. And infantry tactics gradually changed. These developments would become increasingly important during the later stages of the war. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Somme was psychological. The battle destroyed the belief that courage alone could overcome modern weapons. Soldiers could be brave. They could be disciplined. They could obey every order. And yet they could still be destroyed by artillery or machine gun fire before reaching the enemy trenches. The battlefield had become industrial. Factories produced weapons. Railways transported armies. Millions of soldiers were supplied with ammunition on a scale never seen before. The Somme was a brutal demonstration of this new kind of war. For the men who survived, the memories could last a lifetime. Many returned home carrying physical injuries. Others returned with memories of friends who never came back. Families waited for letters that sometimes never arrived. Across Britain, France, and Germany, communities lost large numbers of young men. The effects reached far beyond the battlefield. The Battle of the Somme did not single-handedly decide World War I. It did not produce an immediate Allied victory, but it helped transform the way the war was fought. It revealed the terrible cost of attacking prepared defensive positions. It accelerated the development of new weapons and tactics. It weakened the armies fighting on the Western Front. And it became one of the defining symbols of World War I. More than a century later, the names of the dead are still remembered. The fields of northern France that once shook under artillery fire are now quiet. Grass grows where trenches once stretched for miles. Trees stand where soldiers once crossed no man's land. But beneath the peaceful landscape are the memories of a battle that changed an entire generation. The Battle of the Somme began with the belief that one enormous offensive could break the stalemate. Instead, it became a lesson in the terrifying power of modern warfare. Thousands of soldiers entered the battlefield believing they were fighting for a breakthrough. Many never returned. The battle showed the world that World War I would not be a short war. It would be a war of endurance. A war of factories, artillery, trenches, and millions of soldiers. And the Somme became one of the clearest examples of what that war demanded. On July 1, 1916, an army walked across the fields of northern France. By the end of that day, history had changed. The Battle of the Somme would continue for months. But its first day would remain one of the darkest and most important days in British military history. The battlefield eventually became silent. The war eventually ended. But the lesson of the Somme remained. Modern warfare had changed forever.